Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game tournament report covering CanCon 2026. This was a 60-player event that took place over the Australia Day long weekend in January, and for this event, I played Ariadna. Now, my lists for CanCon are on screen now, but it's actually worth talking a little bit just to begin with about why I chose to play Ariadna for this event. And this is kind of broken down into three things. What were the factions I was considering choosing from? Why did I pick Ariadna? And then, why was Ariadna good? And they're all slightly different. In the run-up to the event, I had four factions in mind. Tartary Core or Ariadna, Hacker's Lamb, and Next Wave. These are all factions that I felt could do the things the event was asking of its players. If you go and have a look at my video about analyzing the event pack, you'll see I talk a lot about things like the ability to secure and control space and then attack into space that your opponent has secured and controlled as one of the main themes of the scenarios of this event, which were provisioning, area of interest, crossing lines, corporate appropriation, and hardlock. Ultimately, during practice games, I would eliminate Hacker's Lamb and Next Wave. Hacker's Lamb just because I didn't really think I would have the time to learn how to play it properly. I've got some fairly significant thoughts about how good Saladin is, which is to say he's very good, but there's a lot of complexity to his play, going from like he's good to he's fantastic, really learning how to maximize things like coordinated orders. On top of that, some of the Hacker's Lamb lists I knew I would want to play would make heavy use of things like vehicles. I'm not super experienced with them still, and in a 5-round event with players from across the country with this many players, there is always a risk you'll run into some tables that are just a little bit tricky. And if I was going to run a list like, for example, Magariba and 2 Flyers, that sounds fun as hell, and it sounds strong as hell, and it sounds like it might just hard lose the game if it gets locked out on table selection. Next Wave I eliminated for similar-ish reasons. I'm of the opinion that Next Wave is very good, but they have some fragility, or perhaps we might call it brittleness. If you get to play Next Wave in a way that puts their strongest pieces forward and uses their strongest pieces consistently throughout the game and forces your opponent to engage those strong pieces, Next Wave feels almost overbearingly fantastic. But if someone gets into the cookie jar, they start killing your line infantry, all of these like 11 and 13 point plebs that you've got back in your deployment zone, or they start picking apart your links or killing your fire team masters, things can begin to deteriorate for Next Wave in a way that can be difficult to come back from. They're also a little tricky to get as many specialists as you might like. Specialists in Next Wave either tend to have to be visible and attackable, or are expensive enough to represent a significant compromise that weakens the rest of the list, and that brittleness I didn't really want to engage with over 5 rounds. On top of that, because there are some things about Next Wave that are very powerful, I have already seen some people banging the usual Combined Army OP drum, and I just didn't want to deal with the YouTube comments that I would have to see if I won an event with Next Wave. And so that left Tartary Army Corps and Ariadna. Both ultimately very similar, and so this is where we get into the, why did I pick these two factions, then why Ariadna, and why was Ariadna good? The reason why I chose to play, in this case Ariadna from the two of them, but why Tartary and Ariadna were in contention, is actually very simple and can be summarized in the phrase, autocannons, and the phrase, please take 6 saves, damage 5, armor piercing. Which is frankly something that shouldn't bring as much joy as it does to a gentleman of my age and refined sensibilities. But ultimately, it does, and I really, really enjoyed playing tank hunters in my games, practicing and preparing for the event, and so, fuck it. Let's lock in Ariadna of some description and then figure out how to go from there. Now, that's why I played the faction, because that shit's just fun. But having settled on Ariadna, okay, let's decide between Tartary Army Corps and Ariadna, and let's make these lists as good as we can. We ultimately settled on Ariadna over Tartary for a couple of reasons. Compared to Tartary, you give up the gunnery links, which is significant, and you give up access to tractor mule couriers, which is moderately significant. But you gain Kibavolks, which are very, very good. They're a fantastic Group 2 unit. They would be present in both of my lists, as you can see. They'd be important in several games. And even the Kibavolk Engineer is very good value, because he's only a few points more than an Ermandino, and he's regular. But in addition to that, you get access to the threat that being a vanilla faction with the wider roster presents. In particular, even though I didn't play any, I had access to multiple parachutist deployment zone models, which are fearsome. and which would force my opponents to consider certain things at list selection, whether choosing to go first or second. They would put all of these little stressors on my opponents over the course of the event, even if I never played any of those pieces. Round 4 in particular we'll talk about significantly adjusted how my opponent chose to approach the scenario just because they had to account for the possibility that I might have Equip Mirage or Van Zandt. Finally, vanilla does give me access to William Wallace, which is not something I really expected to be a significant part of my lists, but after playing him, especially in corporate appropriation, where he's very, very well suited to just aggressively accomplishing that mission, I actually really liked him, and he gave me a flex in my second list that I could pull out in certain circumstances. Okay, so we've settled on vanilla Ariadna. Why was vanilla Ariadna good? There's a few things about them that made them strong and made me happy to play them at this event. And it's not really the tank hunters, they're why it's fun. They're a part of the overall puzzle. Firstly, they're good at area control. They're good at doing the thing I thought I would need to do for this event. While I don't have any hacking, I do have a midfield that includes 2 EM mines and very good AROs that are hard to unpick. The Vistral and the Tank Hunters are strong ARO pieces. The Tank Hunters are difficult to ferret out from the deployment zone because I have 2 Strelocks. Both Strelocks dedicate their decoys to being back in ARO positions alongside the Tank Hunters. Effectively, I'm using the Strelocks as midfield specialists, but to give decoy to those Tank Hunters, which means there is a fog of war in my deployment zone and my opponent can't easily decide what they have to avoid. There are 4 camo markers and a Vistral, usually on Overwatch positions, all of which present existential threats, but 2 of which do nothing and can waste time. So good ARO and good midfield. And as the game progresses, I have some of the best mine dispensing ability in the game. Next Wave is better, it's one of their strengths. Next Wave can do both viral mines and pitches, very strong material deployment, but I can do it cheaply with a pair of dynamos and really just spam mines out if I want. While moving forward, pieces that are aggressive or difficult to kill or dangerous, I can secure space. Cool. The next thing that Ariadna does is that this list in particular, or these lists, are very good at having what I call table insurance. If I just walk up to a table and it sucks, right? Whether it's like a rat warren, which is pretty rare, but you will see those occasionally, or it's just open as hell, I can play both of those. These lists might look like they can be a bit tricky to deploy. Technically, I have 5 Silhouette 4 models, but in practice, those Silhouette 4 models don't compete for the same space. Varuna is always in the one safest position I can find. The Vistral is a sapper and can go wherever the hell it wants, sometimes touching the back table edge, in some cases in the open, because it has foxhole, making maximum use of its range bands. And then the Dynamos, they have limited cover, they don't necessarily need to be in cover, they just need to be wherever they're safe from being shot. And so it's really only, firstly, the tractor mule has to be in some spot where I can use it to reload, and then the dynamos need to be given a little bit of grace somewhere in the more forward positions in my DZ. It's not too difficult to deploy those 4 Silhouette 4 models, and then everything else is either in the midfield or a camouflage marker or something like a dog warrior. Especially during practice for this event, we did a fair bit of stress testing on tables that I would consider not terrible, but maybe on the lower end of what you might run into at an event, and on multiple occasions I had to cash in my table insurance policy. But in those cases, the list performed really well because if you have a shithouse open table, well, cool. I have a Vistral sitting at 40 inches away from you and 4 camouflage markers, 2 of which conceal portable autocannons. This list plays well on those, despite that traditionally being an Ariadna weakness. The next thing about this lists is that they're very good at subverting the emergent hacking metagame, which is a really long way of saying in October we saw hacking added to a few factions that previously wouldn't have been good at it, particularly Pan-Oceanian factions. Neoterra, good hacking faction now. Military Orders, great hacking faction now. I wasn't sure what that would do exactly to the CanCon metagame, but given area control was something I considered to be important, and if you have hacking, that's one of the ways you get area control. I expected there to be something of a potent hacking metagame at CanCon, but because I wasn't sure how strong it would be, I wasn't sure how strong I would need to be to go over the top of it. If you're playing into a topsy-turvy metagame around hacking power, you either want to dominate it completely or not played that game at all. And Toha can do that, and Ariadna does that really well. In every single game I played, my opponents would have at least some, and in some cases significant, points spent on hackers. None of that particularly mattered. I would have one model die to a guided missile, and I would have, over the course of the event, maybe 2 more models that would die as a result of being targeted and then shot. That was it. That was the total return on investment across 5 games for all of my opponents. Going completely underneath a hacking game can be very powerful. Finally, Ariadna, these lists, I was very happy with them having clear lines of play, attacking or defending in basically all of the CanCon scenarios. In practice, I played every scenario from both sides, attacking or going first, going second, and I never had a point where I felt that there wasn't a line that I could pursue. Even in Hardlock, which is considered to be a very difficult scenario going first, and it can be, I had the tools to know how I would approach the game, and that even included in situations where I was going first but didn't feel like I could attack my opponent, because in that case, you can pursue the mission and throw out a whole bunch of mines. You can spend all of your orders doing things like placing deployables. Both combat groups can place a bunch of deployables thanks to the dynamos and then the Kybervolk, so you can get tons of material out there, which means even if you feel like you can't attack your opponent, you can have a productive first turn in basically all of these scenarios. And that's a really significant grab bag of strengths. And so even though I picked Ariadna because of the please make 6 saves effect, they were strong for a bunch of reasons. All right, that's a bunch of talking. What was in these lists? Both of these lists, you can see them on screen now, fundamentally very similar. They are almost completely Tartary Army Corps with a few flex pieces from vanilla Ariadna, and they are also mostly the same across both lists. Having that commonality between lists is not something you always wanted to do, but if you only have so much practice time, it means that you can learn the core rhythms of the list, and you just have those little flexible choices that allow you to respond to table or scenario, etc., opposition, that kind of thing. So from the top, Combat Group 1, Colonel Varuna, Strelok, Scout Mine Layer with EM Mines, 2 Tank Hunters, Dynamo Paramedic, Dynamo AP Spitfire, a Tractor Mule, and then the 10th model in this combat group changed based on the list. In the first list, which we'll call the Dog Warrior list, you can see the names for the courtesy lists on screen. That's just to encourage my opponent to think a little bit about Parachuter's deployment zone. We will just be calling these lists the Dog Warrior list and the William Wallace list, because in the first list, Dog Warriors in Group 1, second list, William Wallace in Group 1. The second combat group, again in both, fundamentally very similar. In the first list, Vistral Neurokinetic, Dozer, Kybervolk, that's your 11-point engineer. In the first list, he has an electronic peripheral, and then a Kybervolk. In the second list, same deal, Vistral, Dozer, Kybervolk. In this case, no electronic. And then the last 2 models are different. In the first list, it's a second Dog Warrior and then a Highlander. In the second list, it's a Sasha and then a Highlander. So there are only 2, maybe 3 if you count the peripheral models different across these 2 lists. In the first list, I have Dog Warriors. In the second list, I have Wallace and a Sasha. Now, by default, I would generally choose to play the Dog Warrior list. It's powerful, it's dangerous. The Dog Warriors do something that's particularly useful for how I play, which is actually that they add spec fire into a list. Now, when you look at a Dog Warrior, it's pretty easy to kind of assume, no, this is a dangerous close assault unit. It's got immunity armor and 3 wounds, and it transmutes, and it's very fast, and it throws smoke, and it has a CC score that begins with the number 2. And while, yes, you can launch dangerous warband-style assaults with Dog Warriors, the main thing I wanted them for is I'm not allowed to take Tractor Mule Couriers in this faction, but I do want good spec fire. And Dog Warriors are actually really good spec fire. They will get themselves forward into the midfield off the back of their impetuous and irregular orders. And for the rest of the game, they can be doing things like throwing spec fire on 11s or 13s if they've transmuted. That's a really high number of spec fire. And if you've got, say, a couple of spare orders in Combat Group 2 and you just chuck some grenades, maybe it does nothing, maybe it significantly shifts the game. And having that asymmetric line of attack is something that I wanted. And they're tough, and they're dangerous, and yes, they can get into close combat. If they've transmuted their CC-23, it's okay, but mostly they're there to kind of try and make a mess and throw grenades at people. Wallace was originally introduced to this mix because he's the best piece we have access to in vanilla Ariadna, and is much better than anything we have access to in Tartary Army Corps, at doing corporate appropriation in particular. Wallace has got a pretty damn good chance of one-shotting an objective in corporate appropriation. Now, Tartary doesn't struggle to do that faction terribly much. Scouts have decharges. You can take multiple scouts in corporate appropriation. You're totally fine. Wallace is a clean line, especially if you have to cross the board aggressively to get to a corporate appropriation prototype that your opponent has gotten back to their deployment zone. Wallace does that kind of better than anything else. He brings his own smoke, although the Galwegian will usually be there to support him, but he's fast enough and dangerous enough to blow through defenses on his way in and get that kill. What Wallace also did is just give me a second option for certain situations at list selection, and that specifically was one of two cases I would use Wallace. The first was if my opponent, if I expected them to have access to units that made Dog Warriors really bad. That might mean lots of viral ammunition. More realistically, it would mean lots of plasma ammunition. If I thought I was going to be playing into, especially next wave, plasma blows through Dog Warriors like they aren't even there. Those 3 wounds disappear in a moment. And so cool, they're just not as valuable. I'll take something like William Wallace because at bare minimum, he's regular. And if he does nothing, I'm a little bit sad about 38 points, but he's a regular order and he has a much cleaner, sharper use case. Dog Warriors can sometimes struggle to kill things. I wouldn't want to run Dog Warriors in up against Blackhearts, for example. But Wallace can throw smoke and get into melee and cut those things up very, very easily, so better in that matchup. The more significant case was that Wallace has Chain of Command. And so if I ever expected to be playing into a matchup where turn 1 assassination was on the table, Wallace gets snapped in. So, for example, if I'm playing against Vanilla Combined Army, or a faction with access to impersonators, or a faction which I suspect might be going heavily in on a guided missile play, or perhaps a faction with parachuters to deployment zone, I could just sub in the Wallace list and go, cool, we're not going to lose an entire turn because someone managed to dive Varuna. Just having that in the back pocket provided quite a lot of comfort, and that would be a decision I would make in one of the non-corporate preparation rounds, meaning I'd play the Dog Warrior list 3 times and the Wallace list twice. Otherwise, these lists are mostly fairly well-rounded. I've got not a lot of specialists, but the specialists are either fast or forward deploying, and the Strelocks being under camouflage means they tend to survive. I can, in a pinch, use the Dozer as a backup specialist. I have the Sasha in the second list, but most of the time my specialist duties would be fulfilled by the Strelocks and the Dynamo Paramedic. I've got a little bit of force reconstitution in the form of 1 Paramedic and 1 Engineer. That also gives me a reasonable amount of classified coverage, along with the Keepervolk providing sensor and visor. Lots of models in the lists being elite or veteran or chain of command. So there's generally a good amount of classified and mission, just objective-based mission play coverage. And finally, although there's 1 model in either list with decent burst, that's the Spitfire on the Dynamo at burst 4 plus 1 special die, one of the interesting just sort of like things that has kind of become a little bit of Ariadna's identity for me is that, by God, there's a lot of armor-piercing or dangerous munitions in these lists. The Strelocks have got AP shotguns, the Scouts got an APT-2 Ohotnik, the Tank Hunters are autocannon, and even that Dynamo team, burst 5 AP Spitfire, burst 4 plus 1 AP Spitfire, burst 2 plus 1 boarding shotgun. Wallace absolutely cranks things. The Keepervolk, if it gets into close combat, can have something like a trench hammer. There's just lots of stuff in here that punches through armor, or at bare minimum presents a possible existential threat when it hits you. And so that kind of leads to a playstyle where there's no one piece in this list that I can lose and lose the game. But there are lots of pieces that present a potential catastrophe for my opponent. If you take an arrow from a scout, just a camouflage marker that was standing in the midfield, and it hits you and you fail your save, that might kill a 50-point heavy infantry. Nothing in the game can really safely risk an arrow from a tank hunter. Lots of things can kill tank hunters, and lots of things would. But every one of those fights potentially represented catastrophe for my opponent and significant value for me. And that was something that was really interesting during playtesting. Even if, over the course of the event, it would materialize from time to time, mostly my opponents played around and through that very effectively, but even then it presents that stress. So very happy with both of these lists. They are built specifically for the CanCon mission mix, but obviously they would go on to perform very well if you've seen the results. And so let's jump into the games and talk through each of them, how the game went, and how the event turned out. Because we're covering 5 games, we aren't going to do a full blow-by-blow, but I will talk through how each of these games played, and you can see a bit of a summary on the right side of the screen there. In round 1, we played Provisioning, playing against military orders, and for this one I used the Dog Warrior list, since I didn't really consider it necessary to have access to William Wallace, but I did know I would really want some of the capabilities that those Dog Warriors provided. And again, they were kind of the default pick. This would be one of the 3 of 5 rounds that I would win the lieutenant role, and I would choose to go first. As it happened, I would end up going first in all 5 rounds, which in some cases you might consider a disadvantage in some of these scenarios, but it suited me fairly well. This was one of the first games, as I mentioned, where playing Ariadna would represent an opponent having an investment in hacking that didn't really matter. In this case, the military orders list I played against, I don't have any of the full lists, but this list included Gabriel de Fersen. That's an expensive heavy infantry whose primary job is to be a hacker. We wouldn't see the Spitfire on him, it would be the multi-rifle, which is a bunch of points that wouldn't do anything for my opponent, so there's just an immediate and useful advantage there. The main pieces in the list otherwise was the link team that DeFerson was part of, which included the Order Sergeant Pitcher Hacker and a Black Friar, who would cause me no end of grief, and then a Seraph. I had not played against a Seraph in N5 yet, so that was going to be an experience. In terms of my deployment, you can see an example of how the tank hunters deploy in this case here. That's 4 camouflage markers on aggressive ARO positioning. 2 of those are decoys being provided by Strelocks. You can see one of the Strelocks nooked in behind this building here, providing its decoy. The other Strelok nooked in behind this sign here, providing its decoy, which helps add fog of war to protect my tank hunters. Otherwise, I have mines scattered throughout the midfield. A Vistral will end up being deployed in this position here, so I'll just leave that there because it's going to be relevant. And post-reserve, I'll have 2 Dog Warriors positioned to aggressively push into the midfield. This is going to be an interesting game of 2 halves games because I'm going to have a really, really good first turn. In provisioning, you basically want to have a situation where you get to do some damage and pull 2 objectives back to your safe area. And I got probably 80% of what I wanted there. So the Dog Warriors would advance forward. There's a Trinitarian up on this rooftop with its deployable repeater. It's going to come down here. It will take 4 chain rifles, and 1 Dog Warrior will end up getting spotlit later on, but I will blow through that in the impetuous phase. And then Dog Warriors will eventually bounce around to here and up to here. The other one will come around to fight the Trinitarian. The first Dog Warrior will blow through the Black Friar and a Custodia up here before ending up on this rooftop, but despite putting something like 6 subsequent chain rifles into the Black Friar, won't kill it, which is going to be a huge pain in the ass. The other Dog Warrior comes around and takes down the Trinitarian. That's excellent. I think he gets wounded and transmutes as part of that, but I'm totally fine with that, because at that point I've killed 3 or 4 of my opponent's models. That's excellent, and I have plenty of orders spare with the dynamos to grab 2 of the supply boxes out of this central cache. I grab the first one with the paramedic, I spend an order and I transfer that over to the Spitfire. I grab the second one with the paramedic again, and then both of them pull back and around. I deposit 1 box in the supply area, and I park the model carrying the other one in the supply area, so if it dies, it'll drop it. And that's basically a really good first turn. I even have 1 final spec fire at the end of this first turn with a Dog Warrior to throw a grenade, something like 11 inches, 12 inches, onto a pair of Croziers that are hanging out here. Now, it doesn't connect, but my opponent has to ARO before he knows that. And that produces a very interesting thing, because he pauses and thinks a really long time about what his ARO is going to be. Which is like, all right, mate, you don't have to tell me one of those is a Knight Commander. You have to go ahead and dodge, because if I hit this, you're in the shit. You don't have chain of command. And he's like, yeah, okay, dodge. This one is the Knight Commander, this one is just the regular Crozier. I don't hit either, but I now have a line of play on round 2. That's going to be significant because on his first turn, the Seraph spools up, and I have to absolutely white knuckle through this turn. Seraphs are really fast and very dangerous, and all of the damage I've inflicted to his order pool has been to the non-Seraph combat group. So it rips around here, it blows through the Dog Warrior on this rooftop in a single face-to-face roll. Not actually particularly weird. The Dog Warrior was spotlit by DeFerson, I think, on the way through. 4 dice on 18s is going to do it to you. And as the Seraph continues to push on through, we have a moment which I'm going to call failing my own personal guts roll. Now, I do think this was ultimately probably the correct decision. I needed to just make sure that my opponent didn't accomplish anything other than killing my stuff this turn. He didn't make any mission progress. But what he did do is he bounced the Seraph through line of sight of all 4 of these camouflage markers. Not the Vistral, but all 4 of the rest. He did that using Super Jump, and I really, really wanted to reveal both Tank Hunters at that point. I don't know if it was correct. I think if I had been losing or behind on scenario, or if he'd grabbed 2 objectives at that point, maybe I would have, because it's ostensibly a very good ARO for me. I'd have been rolling 4 dice on 16s, and he'd have had to split his burst and be rolling 4 dice on 12s backwards, and with the Tank Hunter autocannon rounds being explosive armor piercing damage 5, very good chance I just wipe the Seraph out there. But if he gets lucky, he might kill 2 Tank Hunters for free, forcing me to have revealed them. The whole jig is up. He gets a much freer turn at that point. And because it happened early enough in the turn, I couldn't guarantee that he didn't have the orders to accomplish other stuff, including mission stuff. I had to keep those Tank Hunters camouflaged and watching these side objectives so that he made no scenario progress, which meant I had to just white knuckle through this turn. As the Seraph comes around here, fights the Vistral at 32.5 inches, puts it down. It takes 2 orders to put the Vistral down, despite the Seraph being on 6s and the Vistral being on 12s. He actually ends up reconstituting the Blackfriar with a speedball, gets Ip up and around to help finish off the job. That's ultimately what puts the Vistral down, actually, and then ends up going through both Tank Hunters as well. Only drops them to unconscious because it ends up being the Blackfriar that takes out at least one of them. This is why I really wanted to put that Blackfriar down and why I put so many chain rifles into it, but sometimes the dice be that way. But ultimately, despite a very aggressive counterattack, Vistral goes down, both Tank Hunters go down, one of the Dynamos, the Dynamo Spitfire, goes down. All I suffer are a horrendous number of casualties. What doesn't happen is my opponent puts any progress into the scenario. And what that means is, well, his Seraph pulls back. Seraph actually takes it takes 2 wounds. It does eventually lose a face-to-face with one of the Tank Hunters, takes 2 wounds and pulls back. So it is wounded as part of this fight, but it's intact. That Tank Hunter then goes down to the Blackfriar. The Seraph pulls back and my opponent has made no progress on scenario. I then use this Dog Warrior and the Galwegian. The Blackfire is all the way forward now, so I can get some smoke down here. Dog Warrior bounces down, bounces around, jumps up just to see the Knight Commander. The Knight Commander declares dodge because I have chain rifles, so I peg a grenade at his head, roll like a 14, and the damage 6 puts him unconscious. That puts my opponent in loss of lieutenant for the next turn. And what that's going to mean is another turn with no scenario progress. Now, the Dynamo is going to end up rolling up its sleeves here. It's going to yeet around this direction. It's going to get in under the Blackfriar. It's going to shotgun it down. Excellent, top work. It'll come back around, grab this objective, and pull back in this direction. That will end me up with 3 objectives in this zone. And that's basically the game, which is going to be made slightly worse for my opponent when they go a little bit on tilt in their second loss of lieutenant turn, or in their second turn in loss of lieutenant, and make a bunch of decisions that maybe don't go too well for them. They do put this Dog Warrior down, but they lose 2 models doing it, which means 2 fewer orders in their final round. And perhaps out of an intention to use the Tech B's order productively, he stands the Tech B up and fires a gizmo kit at the wounded but conscious Seraph. And as soon as he declares that, I just have this moment of like terrible clarity in which I can see the future. And I'm just like, I'm just going to have to watch this happen. And I do. And he rolls to hit, and he hits, and I can see the dice before it lands, and he rolls a 16, and just his soul leaves his body as his Seraph goes unconscious. Now, realistically, I had won the game by the end of my second turn. There was just not enough time. He didn't have enough resources. There was no way to push through the elements that I had. I'd recovered one of my Tank Hunters with a speedball. The Vistral was back up. I still had the Scout and the EM mines in the midfield. There was too much left and too few orders and too little time left in the game for him to do anything. But that was the nail in the coffin. The final sort of remnants of the turn for me are trying to get either my classified or this box on my third turn, but a single Crozier firing at 30 inches kills both the Galwegian and the Dynamo on their attempts to make it through, so fine, you got it, Crozier, you saved the day. This would keep me from scoring more than, I think 8 points was the number I scored in this scenario, but that's enough for a win with the offensive bonus and gets us through to round 2. In round 2, we're playing against Nick from Loss of Lieutenant, who I had never met in person, but I knew from the show. I don't get a chance to watch particularly much in the way of hobby content. I don't watch terribly much like War Machine Infinity or conquest content, for example. But when I have watched Loss of Lieutenant, Nick is the one that you always note as the like really good value takes. If there's ever a point or a discussion on that show that looks like it's being presented from a position of like well-researched, well-considered, analytical, thoughtful presentation, it's usually because Nick is talking. So this promised to be a really good game, and I didn't know his list, but I had been told, like a couple of people had like walked up to me and just gone like, haha, Nick's list. And so I was prepared for some shenanigans, and I wasn't let down. I'm sure he will cover it on the show if he hasn't already. But this list was an absolute off-meta cracker consisting of a Suryat Lieutenant with +1 orders, and then 5 Umbra of different stripes. It was something like 2 of the Hacking Device Plus Pitcher Umbra Legates and 3 of the Umbra Samaritans with Killer Hacking Device things. It meant that all of them could Cyber Mask, all of them could link, and between NCO and Tactical Awareness, the list actually had a fairly healthy order pool, despite otherwise being shockingly non-traditional and very low model count. There were a couple of pieces that were off the board, which I think resulted in this being a legal limited insertion list, i.e. you couldn't strip orders from it. That wouldn't matter in this case because Nick won the lieutenant role and elected to choose deployment side. He deployed second on the far side of the table relative to me, obviously. I chose to go first. Now, I picked the William Wallace list in this particular case for 2 reasons. The first was the broad Onyx have some shenanigans, but in particular, they have access to both pitchers, guided missiles, and Greif operators, and I did not want to risk going second into the possible loss of lieutenant situation. So chain of command was on the menu. Secondly, Onyx is a force with plenty of access to plasma, and nope, Dog Warriors ain't good against that. On the other hand, William Wallace is one of the few models in the game that is advantaged against something like an Umbra Samaritan or Norcaius in close combat. Not by a lot, but if it's my turn and I'm forced to go into CC with one of those pieces, Wallace is one of the few models in the game that actually has an advantage. In their term, nope, probably he loses, but even then it's a little bit scary. So Wallace was on the field for this one. And this game was a bit of a showcase in why having multiple lanes of play is really valuable, because Nick's null deployment was basically immaculate. There was there were 2 gunfights I got to take on the first turn. The first was Wallace coming all the way up and around here and then shooting a flash pulse remote on the back table edge. The flash pulse remote was out of cover because it was sitting on the back table edge watching the long lines, because Nick kind of had to respect the possibility that I could have a parachutist deployment zone turning up. But it would actually just crit flash pulse Wallace and he would have to go and hide. He would come back to fight it in a later turn. So the only kill I would get on the first turn was this scout on this big rooftop here coming around to shoot down against a Icadron, eventually putting it, I think it took 2 goes, but I put it dogged and then just went back into camouflage and re-entered and put a mine back down. But that meant I got all of 1 kill on my first turn. But I had lines of play that would still get me some value. So obviously this is area of interest. We get the Sasha forward, she presses the button, she comes back. We run the Kiba Volk out and around into the special area of interest. That's the blue zone here. Despite the fact that it's further away from my deployment zone, it had better hiding spots from gunfighting. I wasn't convinced that I could use these little crates and boxes here to really keep a model safe inside the closer area of interest. So even though I had 1 area of interest here on the grounds that it would be easy to secure in the late game, the special area of interest was a bit further away, but with better cover. The Kiba Volk runs all the way up to that, plonks down a crazy koala, and then most of the rest of the turn involves the dynamos just spewing mines out everywhere. Now, not all of them will be triggered by the end of the game, but you can actually see this is a photo taken at about partway through or possibly the end of my first turn, and you can see I've even got things like mines in my deployment zone just as a hedge against stuff that could be coming. Mainly though, we get a bunch of mines down in this space around here, including a couple that are going to end up protecting the area of interest itself, and that's very relevant. There's a misplay that I made on this first turn, actually, which might have helped me deliver a more decisive blow, and that's that I did not have the presence of mind to do an SWC count. I eyeballed the table and went, there's only 1 model with a gun, so surely there can't be that much SWC, so I spent most of the first turn scared of Noctifers. Should not have been, because, yes, there's only 1 model with a big gun, the Suryat HMG. Didn't really click that every single one of those Umbra probably cost half an SWC. When I asked Nick about this at the end of the round, I was like, you know what, I should check. How many SWC can I see? And he tells me, you can see 5. And then I go, how many SWC is a Cascuda? It's 1. Oh, fucking god damn it. But the Cascuda, at least I was prepared for. One of the very nice things about tank hunters as ARO pieces is that while they're camouflaged, they have 360 line of sight. And so basically anywhere a Cascuda might have landed in this space, it was potentially copying 6 saves to the dome immediately on landing. Wasn't hugely concerned about that. Wouldn't matter for the first turn anyway. Nick goes into his first turn with plenty of orders and very mobile pieces, and so he's got a fairly clear plan that would come to within about a fraction of an inch of succeeding. One of the Samaritans drops into Cybermask and begins to move. And so, cool. Nick's plan is to get a model that is much more expensive than a Kiba Bulk into this zone, score points, and then kind of make it be my problem. The problem he has is that he has to do most of his movement super jumping kind of in the open through line of sight of pieces, and that means I'm able to make a pretty large number of Discover rolls against him. With no penalty to those rolls, and Discover having relatively forgiving range bands, and just good rolls on my part, one of the themes of this entire event actually would be that if I had to make a ballistic skill attack, lap of the gods, I would not win that many gunfights this game, or in fact across the event at large. But if I had to make a willpower 13 roll, pretty good chance that I could get it, which, you know what, I'll take. And in this case, that meant that the Samaritan kept getting discovered. Now, Nick's movement was very clean here. Every super jump move, he would end in a position where he could re-cybermask, but he had to re-cybermask every single order. And so it meant that even with a reasonable sized order pool, he's not getting tactical awareness because he's had to leave those models behind to cybermask. It's cybermask, move, cybermask, move, cybermask. And that took a run that could have been very clean into a challenge because he finally gets the Samaritan all the way around here, and he's in a position where he's had to put so many orders into recybermasking that he is discovered making the approach. He's finally out of line of sight of these suspicious camouflage markers that keep holding. Actually, at one point, one of the tank hunters revealed, but that's because what had happened was that he had moved, I had discovered, and then he had said something which I had just heard white noise because the crowd was so loud. And then he'd moved again, and I put the tank hunter down and said, "I'm going to shoot you." And he's like, "No, I've re-cybermasked." I'm like, "You what? You re what?" Which is very awkward. So he knew at least one of these was a tank hunter, but that is what it is, and he was a gentleman about that. I just completely failed to hear him say because he just flipped the order and then moved on. And so after much confusion, I finally figured out what was going on, at which point he knew one of these models was a tank hunter. Didn't change any of the movement at all, and in any case it was the visceral and other pieces that were discovering while the tank hunter held. He got in and around underneath that line of sight, but he was discovered on the move in. That means that he couldn't just move into this area of interest, and equally importantly, he couldn't just move into melee with the Kiba Volk, which meant that he had to do a move dodge. If he succeeds, he gets into the zone, he survives, he has many more points than a Kiba Volk, and he's my problem in my next turn. If he fails, he cops potentially an awful lot of damage. What happens is that he rolls a 15, which is a crit against the Crazy Koala, against the Kiba Volk's Trench Hammer, against the Boarding Shotgun, but a failure against the 2 mines, and he gets very unlucky and fails both saving throws, which means that after all of this work and all of this effort, he's down a 36-point model and has wasted an entire turn. All he's done is clear through some deployables, which have already reloaded from the baggage bot in this building. And that sucks. That really sucks, because this was a very clever line of play that bad luck disrupted. And there wasn't even really a particular way to do it more efficiently. There was a discussion that we had early in the round, which was like, hey, super jump kind of doesn't 100% work that way. This is something I think we maybe need to have a little bit of clarification in the rules, because there's the whole, and we had a conversation about this on day 2, and where we spent, like, he just caught up with me, and we spent about 10 minutes discussing the nature of the geometry of a parabola. Because regular super jump, which is what Samaritans have, is parabolic movement, if you are flush up against a vertical surface, you can't super jump over that because a parabola is curved. And so you need to super jump over something. You need like an inch and a half of leeway to get the parabola up and over. Otherwise, you just contact the surface. You can't proceed. Now, that's no issues with dog warriors. I habitually keep them away from that kind of terrain so that they can jump because they have no cover anyway. But it really caught Nick by surprise and cost him maybe half of an order, which was going to end up being significant. If I'd failed any of these discover rolls, then that saves him an entire order as well and maybe lets him get around into the zone in a marker state. Now, the Kibavolk almost certainly discovers him. It has a biovisor, but he's in there at that point, and he isn't discovered until the resolution of the order, which means none of the mines trigger. Ideally, he might even have the option of getting all the way around and into close combat with the Kibavolk and killing it and eating 2 wounds as a means of surviving the incoming damage from all of the explosives. There was just enough deployables that would have been a risky play. Ultimately, he didn't have the orders for that either. And so, a very good first turn play on his part with a very non-traditional list ultimately wasn't successful. That scored me 2 points. I still went into my second turn with control of that objective, with control of the antenna. That's very hard to come back from. I would be able to do more damage over subsequent turns. Wallace would eventually kill that flash pulse bot that flash pulsed him. I would lay down more mines. Nick would respond by landing a Fractor Hacker down back of my deployment zone. It would be a pain. It would spotlight the Vistral. The Vistral would die to a missile. But because I had Chain of Command on the field, Nick didn't bother also trying to spotlight and kill Varuna. The distance between Varuna and the missile was going to be well over like 42, 43 inches in any case. And that means that on my third turn rather, I can clean off the Fractor and Wallace can get up and around. There's nothing left to stop him. He gets into line of sight with the Suryat, gets into CC with the Suryat, cuts it in half, and that means Nick begins his last turn in loss of Lieutenant. I've got ample orders left to reconstitute forces, get the Vistral back up, kill the Fractor, get into zones, and so all Nick has to do on his last turn is get an Umbra Legate into this zone over here. Yep, that scores him 1 point, and then very cheekily reveal a Malignos hanging out down here. The Malignos moves, gets within a couple of inches of the deployment zone of the special area of interest, and then dodges. Now, if he gets in, it's not going to win him the game, but it will score him a bunch of points and might get him defensive bonus. He cops more AROs than God. He takes a Tank Hunter ARO, the Kibavolk ARO, a boarding shotgun. It triggers something like 5 mines, and the little bugger almost survives all of them. He rolls a 9 on his dodge, which I think is a crit against the mines and a success against everything else, beats every other face-to-face roll except the boarding shotgun, which crits, and does 1 wound, and knocks it unconscious out of the zone. And at the end of the game, in the states phase, it regenerates, which controls my HVT. He's done his classified already, but that prevents me from securing his HVT. Cheeky son of a bitch. Still lots of points. I can't remember what this was. This was like, I think, another 8-point win. So we're on 2 majors. A wonderful game. Nick was a fantastic opponent. And genuinely, as much of his list is wildly non-traditional, in a different scenario where he didn't have to cross this much of a gap, I could very easily see a situation where these things just ran at me and really could have caused some damage. I don't have a clean answer to fast, reasonably high order count, can't strip orders, cyber masked, Prothean plasma models. That's collectively kind of a nightmare for this Ariadna in general, because he can breeze past my midfield, get in underneath my ARO defenses, then just chicken amongst the henhouse. But because we were playing Area of Interest and I'm so deep set in the DZ, that was never really an option. Could be a very scary list in specific circumstances. It is wildly non-traditional. Props to Nick for trying it out. Looking forward to seeing how it's covered on Loss of Lieutenant. Round 3 is the final round of day 1, and we're playing Crossing Lines. And this was a different game kind of experience to the previous 2, and a little bit of a showcase in the difference that preparation can make. I was playing against Brian, I believe from Melbourne, who was playing Operations Subsection. And the big key thing here is that Brian had gotten some practice in this scenario, but just sort of coincidentally, every time he'd played this scenario, he'd gone first. And in this case, I won the LT roll and I went first. And end of the day, you're tired, you've played 2 games, it's hot, we're in a big shed effectively, and muscle memory takes over, and he deployed like he was going first. And that meant he had a bunch of models in the midfield, including a robot link of Riksha and Dawan tac bots, which deployed on top of this building, looking towards my deployment zone, and then I reserve dropped a dog warrior behind them. And then in this building here, he had a link of two Dakini and a Denavus, ready to move into this zone, and I reserve dropped a dog warrior in front of them. And that produced one of the most violently offensive first turns I've had, although there would be some competition for it on day 2 of this event. Now, ultimately, 2 Dawon tac bots, more than a match for a dog warrior, and they would end up dodging into CC, but the chain rifles here would put the rickshaw down, and both of those Dawon had to dodge standing to get into close combat with the Dog Warrior, which means that on his turn, when they activated, they were still in a fire team. One of them stabbed the Dog Warrior stabbed the other one, and every gun I had just lit that rooftop up, which meant that by the end of that order, nothing was left standing and everything was dead, which meant that a 21-point Dog Warrior traded for 3 models. The Dog Warrior around here would survive. He would put down all of the models inside this room. It was just aggressively violent. On top of that, the scout that I had in this position up and around here would peek around, would lay down an EM mine on his Marut lieutenant. The Marut would have to dodge when I moved across the gap to shoot it with my Ohotnik. Fail the dodge, isolated, immobilized, no worries, the chain of command takes over, but it's too much, basically. I'd even be able to get some wounds onto the Marut by bringing the Dynamo team all the way up and around here, firing off the AP Spitfire. Wouldn't do more than 1 wound to it and wasn't willing to risk giving it too many resets. But even that meant that when he spent his turn getting the Marut back up, getting it out of that state, moving up and around, in this area, in his forward position, in his forward dead zone, I had something like a Dog Warrior and a Scout and both Dynamos and possibly the Galwegian, either way on the count, 90 points, which was the same as the Marut was. The Marut does its best. It tries to fight the Vistral, has to do so at bad range, gets wounded doing that. I try to fight it with the Tank Hunter in my turn. It puts the Tank Hunter down an arrow, because of course it does, but I've got enough stuff to just throw into it. In the end, a Dog Warrior and a Galwegian get into it, put it down, and then coup de grace it, because I do not want to risk him recovering that thing. And once I coup de grace the Marut, he calls uncalled, taps out, we just tally up the score, and that's the end of the game. Wonderful opponent, really lovely to play against. Absolutely this was a case where practice made an enormous difference. Specifically, my opponent only having had the chance to practice this scenario going first, never practicing it going second. Very significant deployment mistakes, which if he hadn't made, if he just pulls those pieces back, he's much more conservative what he puts in the midfield, he plays this like a traditional game, I probably still throw Dog Warriors at him, which are very good in this matchup, but I end up doing things like probably having to do things like take Spec Fire. I push him back, the score probably stays fairly even. It is difficult for him to bomb into my far zone, pushing them a route through EM mines and through Tank Hunter autocannon fire arrow. But he's in a much, much better position than he is effectively losing 7 models and getting his lieutenant isolated and immobilized on the first round. So, well done to Brian for grinning and bearing it through 2 turns. I do not begrudge him the tap out at all. Beautifully painted army, and with a bit more practice, I think he'd have done much better in this particular case. Round 4 would be corporate appropriation into Varuna. And because this was the first round of day 2, and we basically knew what the pairings would be, since Ivory and I were both top table, this is one I had a little bit of a run-up for. It's also, very interestingly, one where my decision to play vanilla Ariadna paid significant dividends early in the game. The reason for that is that Ivory won the lieutenant role and picked deployment zone side, which meant I could choose to go first. Now, I think I could probably have played this scenario from first or second, but the general point is I had a plan and I was comfortable with it. I actually kind of wanted to go first because I do think first player is advantaged in this scenario. Ivory had some good rationale. Their rationale for wanting deployment, and therefore not first turn, is that they could not predict or be sure that I wouldn't have Van Zandt or Equip Mirage. They had to respect that threat. Because they're playing Varuna, they are best positioned to defend against that with their deployment zone fully intact. They have a cutter, they have helots, they have a very robust defensive setup, but that setup begins to unpack itself as they have to move into the midfield, which means that if they go first, they will have the fewest orders in order to get to the central objective and steal it, and they assume the greatest risk from parachutist deployment zones. This is specifically in the context of the faction that they're playing, which has that really good defensive setup. For my part, I wanted to go first because I did not have any of those pieces, and I had no intention at all of fighting anything in his list if I could avoid it. My rule when playing against Varuna How do you fight a cutter? How do you fight helots? You just don't. Just if you can avoid it at all, unless you have very purpose-built tools, you do not fight those pieces. And so I inflicted 0 damage on them on turn 1, but I incurred no damage myself. What I was able to do was move pieces up and around. The bikes would lay down a bunch of smoke. There was an MSV-1 ARO piece in the form of a Kamau heavy rocket launcher, but some smoke down here still puts a significant penalty on it, and the Sasha is able to move up and around. She touches the objective here in base contact with cover and within 16 of the Kamau and gets away, and that means that when the Kamau rolls to hit, I actually get quite lucky and she survives. She then runs all the way back up into my deployment zone. Cool, I have exfiltrated, just using my group 2 orders, I have exfiltrated the corporate prototype. Yes, it took a bunch of orders to lay that smoke, particularly because Ivory has a very nice line all the way down here, but it does terminate at this building, so the bikes have to come up and around the building. On the way around and through and then eventually back, they just lay every mine they possibly can. I seed this entire area with mines. I pull everything back to a position of safety, and then I pass turn back to Ivory. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages here. The advantage is, excellent, I am up on scenario, I have the objective, that's the first condition met, and now Ivory has to come and try and get the objective from me, and I have it under a position of maximal defense. The disadvantage is that they have all of their orders to play with. Now, we speak about this after the game, and there's kind of one key mistake that Ivory makes over the course of this. They take the Kamau team with a Pathfinder, Tactical Awareness, and a Montesa. This stuff is gross, it's incredibly points efficient, incredibly powerful. They move up and forward. They have to skirt through some camouflage marker lines of sight. The Pathfinder does stellar work, sort of like figuring out what's what, confirms that there is a EM mine and a scout hanging out here. Ultimately, though, spend a bunch of orders clearing off mines, shooting them at range, and then the Pathfinder makes the run, moves up to through line of sight to grab the objective. Boom, tank under autocannons, take it down. Cool, no problem. That was part of the plan. That they've gotten kind of out of line of sight of some of the tank hunters. Reform the link. Kamau can take the fight from here. Kamau puts down the first tank hunter. They've bled a little bit for their troubles. They've spent a lot of orders, but they're able to pull the Kamau and the Knight of Montesa back to inside this building here, which is about as safe as they can get them. This is sort of where the misplay occurred. The misplay specifically is, at that point, the reflex that they had built over the course of the event so far took over, because they had spent the entire day 1 cuttering the shit out of their opponent. And presented with a full order pool and an untouched cutter, they proceeded to move the cutter out and try and kill me. And the cutter moved up and around, moved into line of sight of this revealed tank hunter, expecting presumably a discover, at which point I promptly declared dodge and went prone because I ain't fighting that shit. That left the cutter with 0 targets, so it had to just pull all the way back, and that was it. That was the entire combat group. What should have happened is that Asasha, which was hanging out here, should have walked around, picked up the objective, and then walked back, gotten back to as much of a position of safety as she could. Yes, she's much slower than a cutter, but she still had plenty of movement to do that, and that would have put the objective in a much safer position, with the Montesa and the Kamau now acting as defensive pieces. Instead, the ARO presence is all picked apart, the Kamau is hunkered down in the midfield, and I can collapse in on this. A bunch of smoke, a bunch of mines, the Kivavork lays out a crazy koala. I bury this position in deployables, and I hit it with the Dynamos and William Wallace. Casualties are sustained. Ultimately, on the second last order, William Wallace coup de grace his way through the Kamau, cuts the objective in half, and that puts me on a massive scenario lead, because my prototype is still secured, and Ivory's is not. There's a bunch of back and forth at this point, continued attritional fighting. Wallace dies. Ivory does some classifieds. I move into my Infernal turn. I accomplish 2 of my 3 classifieds. I would have gotten the third. It was actually a wonderful, 4 orders almost got me 3 classifieds. But the Galwegian that went unconscious decided that it wanted to die to a paramedic dart, so I was only able to accomplish Censor the HVT and Predator having been accomplished by Wallace, coup de growing a Kamau, and the Galwegian coup de growing the Zulu Cobra that had moved forward to try and data scan my HVT. That leaves Ivory in a position where they basically just have a Hail Mary to try and secure points, and that is that the cutter needs to move around to the objective, the panoply, pull decharges, and then run at my deployment zone. And they do it. And credit to them, they get a really, really long way. The Kibavolk is dodging, trying to pin them down. They get the panoply, they move up and around, they have the decharges, but they're in a point where their order count is such that they really just have to be moving. And eventually that means they're moving through line of sight of multiple flash pulses, multiple mines, a suppressive fire, AP Spitfire, and a tank hunter. And on the terminal approach, as the cutter mantles up onto this objective, it finally gets taken down to unconscious by the tank hunter. That ends the game. Very well played. Was a very reasoned approach to the matchup from Ivory, and a little bit like my round 2, where this matchup could have been very difficult and very dangerous in a different scenario. I think that was the case here. If this had been a scenario like crossing lines, where there wasn't realistically a way for me to outpoint the cutter if it wanted to move into a zone, I would have been left with no choice but to try and fight conventionally against Varuna defenses. I don't particularly want to do that because there's really no way for me to engage a cutter. I can hope to get into it in close combat, but even then it can potentially be relieved by one of the 2 Montesa Knights that are in Ivory's list. And so having a game where I could almost exclusively just pursue the scenario objectives really helped. That put me on my 4th major win and sent me to the finals. The finals would be against James, also from Melbourne, and this would be another pretty critical piece of luck. This would be the 3rd game out of 5 that I would win the lieutenant role, and I would pick deployment. Now, we're playing hardlock. Hardlock is a scenario that can be won by the second player, just surviving, and then pressing buttons. That's kind of a conventional wisdom. It's difficult to win this as the first player. You have to very decisively secure an attritional advantage so that your opponent just does not have the resources. James is playing Invincible Army. He makes the very difficult decision to go second. That means that I am deploying second and going first. I'm playing the Dog Warriors list for this game. I spend a command token for an extra reserve, which means my 3 reserves are 2 Dog Warriors and a Kibavolk. Now, the Dog Warriors actually won't do a massive deal in this case. They will be very important later on. It's other pieces that will be decisive on the first turn, but they will be decisive. In terms of James's deployment, we've got Flash Pulse remotes hanging out on the back of the table edge, doing that same thing as before, where they're just watching for Parachuter's deployment zone. And there's otherwise 3 main centers of strength. His reserve drop is a Yanhuo on this bridge over here, which he'll put into suppressive fire. The Yanhuo can be very difficult for me to put down. I had some practice games against it, and it's one of those pieces, immunity armor, very good against my list. Tank Hunters, all of the stuff that I'm playing AP for, APT2, not good against a Yanhuo, so good reserve drop. Over here, he's got a powerful fire team. It's a modern classic Invincible Army fire team, where it's more built around hideout. Specifically, you can see a missile bot on the roof there, but the important pieces are 2 hideout, 1 sniper, 1 killer hacker, and an invincible tin bot tactical awareness. The invincible is what lets that link form up. The hideout are what give it bonuses. That's going to be relevant. There is a Gudan on the ground over here. There's a Warcore hanging out down here. There are some Zanchi scattered around. One of them is the Lieutenant. I won't get a kill on it all game. And then there are camouflage markers. There are 3 camouflage markers clustered in this space, fairly telegraphed as a Zencha and 2 mines. There's 1 camouflage marker prone on this roof, and there's 1 camouflage marker prone on this roof, fairly telegraphed as Zencha hackers. And because I get to see basically all of this, I get to plan my offense pretty much perfectly. Now, what I expected to do was go up the guts, plenty of smoke, avoiding the hideout with the Dog Warriors. Doesn't actually happen that way because the Yanhuo comes down as the reserve drop, a good piece, but I have a plan for dealing with Yanhuo. Basically, my best option against it, I can do things like coordinate Tank Hunter fire, or just fight it with the Tank Hunter and hope to push through on dice and damage 5, but the best piece to begin with is the Dynamo. If I get inside 24 or inside 16, he's in suppressive fire, so I'll take the first fight from within 24, force him to break suppressive. It's not a bad face-to-face roll, and if I throw down a bunch of mines on him first, I can actually put him under serious threat. And so we get some impetuous movements forward because the dogs were my reserve drops. They can very safely impetuous. I know that they're fine, and the dynamos come up and around. First face-to-face roll. Dynamo Paramedic lays down 2 mines where they'll detonate on the Yanhuo. Spitfire takes the corner. Yanhuo decides to dodge in order to avoid taking... No, it shoots back. Sorry, it decides to shoot back. It drops out of suppressive. And the sodding thing actually wins the face-to-face roll, but it does just 1 wound with a double action round to my Dynamo. The mines blow up, deal 1 wound to it. He chooses to stay standing, realizing that, yep, he probably has to, so I've pulled back, out of line of sight, push forward, lay down the mines again, take the fight again. I've gone dogged with the Dynamo Spitfire, and this time I put it down. Now, it takes a few orders, but I've got plenty left because he hasn't stripped orders because he's gone into Suppressive Fire, which he immediately dropped. Yanho is unconscious. Reckoning that, well, the Dynamo is dogged's going to die at the end of the round, let's just fucking go. And so she's going to move up and clear off the Warcore, push up through here. He declines to reveal this camouflage marker, and so we just get in amongst it. We end up killing this drone bot over here, coming up and around and getting a very significant kill, firing 24 inches downtown at the Invincible down here, shooting in the back and putting it unconscious. That breaks the fire team, and there's nothing left around those hideout that can be used to reform it. Which means those hideout are now solo, which means that the one remaining gun in James's list that threatens anything in my army has just lost its special die. Now, the Dynamo gets flash pulsed at that point, she's dogged, she dies at the end of turn. That is a lot of casualties, and I still have my second combat group. The Kiba Volk moves up and around here, senses out the Zencha hacker on the rooftop, and then just climbing pluses up onto her, beats her to death with a trench hammer. It doesn't have many orders left at this point, so it lays down a crazy koala just to try and stop James from reconstituting the Yanhuo, but it's too much damage, basically. It's too much, it's too dangerous. There's been too much that has been done, particularly just by the Dynamo. And the way the casualties have lined up has left James with 5 orders in each combat group. Now, I do have something that I need to note about this little bit of the fight just here, which is that, yep, I played the entire turn, and this was the only game that it mattered, I played the entire turn as though the Keeper Volk had Climbing Plus. And I've just paused the video and gone and checked. I would have sworn black and blue that it did, but it didn't. So, I owe James an apology for that. That was an absolute misplay on my part. I'm not sure it would have enormously changed the outcome of the game. It would have been possible for the Kibervolk with Dogged to get up there anyway and get that kill, but it would have cost 1 more order, it would have prevented the man trap going down, and it could, for example, have resulted in the Kibervolk getting shot and having to go Dogged to secure the kill, which would have freed up orders on James's second turn. That's something I have to be very clean about that. I've just gone and checked. The model does not have that rule. I was absolutely 100% convinced that it did, but it didn't. Well, wouldn't be a major event without some kind of controversy. A little bit disappointed in that in retrospect. Hell of a thing to uncover as I'm partway through a recording, but it is what it is. Moving on with the game. Whether or not the Kibervolk had died up on that rooftop in the process of killing the specialist or not, there's too much damage done to James's army, and he's in too difficult a position to try and recover. There's some sniper shots from the hideout as it moved down and around here. It used those to kill the Kibervolk. If the Kibervolk had been dead at that point, it would have done something like engage the Vistral instead. But as that would happen later in the game, James very quickly came to the conclusion that none of these gunfights are particularly good. Without the special die available to the hideout, it's rolling 2 dice on 13s versus the Vistral 2 dice on 12, or if it fights the Tank Hunters, both of which are clustered here by the by, it would have been fighting 2 dice on 13s versus 2 dice on 13s. That's rough as an active turn attack, and he didn't have a position where he could easily get the Yanhuo back up. The baggage bot up here was potentially in position to do it, but it's being watched directly by this scout, and it's going to have to sustain shots along the way. It's all just very difficult and very dangerous. In the end, he takes some gunfights in this central area. He puts down the Kibervolk, which, as we've noted, should probably have been dead at that point. A misplay on my part, getting a rule wrong. And then he runs up the guts with the Gudan, looking to put flamethrowers into my warbands. He does actually kill the Galwegian, although the Dog Warrior survives, gets put down by ARO fire. That's basically his turn, passes back to me. I'm able to use the Dog Warrior to defang this central area. Discover, shoot the Zensha mine layer, get into close combat with it and tie it down, and then go about pressing buttons and getting more kills. I never deal with the hideout sniper, I never need to. I do put down the Zensha. I actually think I end up engaging it in close combat on my second turn. Most of the second turn is spent pressing buttons. So we get this button pressed, and then the Strelok moves in this direction, and the Dog Warrior in the primary combat group, who's been moving forward, comes up and around, steals the objective, and then runs all the way back to here. That's the bulk of the second turn, so I actually don't get any Zensha kills this turn, sorry. But I do secure the beacon, and I secure it on my second turn. That Dog Warrior is going to hang out here with the beacon for the remainder of the game. You don't necessarily need to do that if you're going first in hardlock, if you can secure a decisive enough attritional advantage, but it is a very bloody good idea. That's going to get me 1 point at the end of this round, 1 point at the end of the next round, and then points for having it secured in my deployment zone, and my opponent won't get the points for having their beacon not captured. That's enough to just about equalize any risk that I might incur from having him having a run on the final round to press multiple buttons. On his second turn, he brings the Zencha Killer Hacker out from hiding. It's hanging up on this rooftop. It's going to come down and press this button, but it's under very aggressive overwatch. There is a Vistral, there is a Scout, Ohotnik, and 2 Tank Hunters basically watching that position. And while he's very good with his movement, he takes ARO fire moving in, survives, and presses the button, but I'm going to put him down on the final round. A Tank Hunter will actually climb up into this space. Multiple autocannon shots later, we'll put this Zencha down. He's cleaned off the Dog Warrior at this point with the Hideout. The boarding shotgun, 3 shots, just hits all 3 of them and puts the Dog Warrior down, but the Tank Hunter puts down that Zencha as well. That's a lot of points off the board. He isn't at risk of loss of Lieutenant, although he is close, but it's too many casualties. I press this second button over here, I maintain control of this objective, I secure his treasure, and on his last turn, basically his Hail Mary to score points is to move his Hideout forward, his Killer Hacker. He's gotten it into a marker state, he moves it up and around. There's too much. There's too much watching him. I've got too many free discover rolls. I discover him on the way in, and 4 inches out from the objective, he's got to, so 8 inches out from the objective, he's got to move. He takes autocannon fire from 2 separate Tank Hunters, fire from a Scout, an Acrolat Canon shot from the Dozer, which is moved forward. It had Acrolat Canon from the draw a card, a specialist of your choice gets this, and he gets cleaned up by the Tank Hunter autocannons. So that means that he is not able to press this button. If he had been able to, he'd have 2 buttons and more buttons than me for 4 points, but I have this button, I have the treasure secured, and I have all of the points from the beacon, which ultimately is a win. It turns into a major win. That's enough to secure me the 25 tournament points. That puts me in first place off the back of a very aggressive offensive strike, which is one of the ways that you can win this scenario going first. Now, again, I am real fucking embarrassed about getting rules wrong on the Key Revoke. I noticed that literally only as recording. I thought to go and check. I'll just make sure as I'm saying that. Nope, that model does not have that rule. I will be messaging James an apology after this. I don't think it would have colossally changed the outcome of the game, but it could have, and we were playing on top table. And I should know my fucking army special rules. So, significant apology to James. A bit of a sad note to end on as far as this video goes. Overall, though, very happy with how Ariadna played. Happy with the performance of the army, especially happy with how the Dynamos and the Vistral and the Kibavolk, just being a sensor and mantrap layer much of the time, and Wallace in those games when I used him, all those pieces super fun and very good. The Tank Hunters, which were much of the reason for being for the army, were mostly okay, but their performance over the course of the event mostly limited to some scavenger kills during my rounds and decent ARO pieces and delay, which was a less potent performance than they had generally had during practice. Still, that's the nature of the beast. Not everything always works the way you'll expect it. Sometimes things work a little bit worse, sometimes things work a little bit better. And my embarrassment about that rule snafu notwithstanding, overall, 5 fantastic games, multiple opponents I had never played against before, all of them fantastic people to play against, and a really excellent social experience around the whole tournament. Do not regret playing at all. It was great to come out of hibernation and have another crack at the serious Infinity competition scene, and really, really good to see everyone again in and around the convention. Well played to all of my opponents, and an absolutely fantastic job by the event organizers who organized the entire thing. That wraps up this video. Hope very much that you've enjoyed it. As you might guess, after 2 days yelling in a shed or yelling at a pub, my voice is a little bit on the way out, but I wanted to get this recorded and released soon after the event. Not sure when our next video will be because I'm going to need a little bit of recovery time, but I do very much hope to be back soon with more Infinity content, battle reports, tactics videos, faction focuses, etc. If you'd like this, go ahead, click like, subscribe if you can. As of this week, we crossed over the 5,000 subscriber milestone, which is a little milestone, but really nice for a channel of this size covering content this niche. Hope very much you've all enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.